John Joe, good afternoon.
Jeff, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
My pleasure. Welcome to the Medium Podcast. How's the week been treating you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, good, Jeff. Yeah, fairly typical, I would say.
Yep.
Yeah, quite a lot of activity going on. Yeah, it's been quite packed full. I suppose what's happening. I think we've all got our eye on the macro economic conditions to see what might be around the corner
Yeah.
in my industry. But yeah, fairly typical, I would say, in terms
Fairly
of what we do
typical,
day
eh?
to day. But yeah, pretty good.
I think you had a podcast that was coming or before where you brought on a guest, I believe, who worked in the markets, who wanted to share how the macro environment could potentially affect the sort of the hiring recruitment space. Is that correct? Or
That's right. So I did have a conversation similar to this morning, Jeff, with a lady, Raquel, from a VC firm. And that's right. So as I mentioned, there's a little bit of caution across a lot of my customers and their partners and people I speak with on the day to day in
mm,
terms of supporting them with hiring and employment opportunities. So, and we're trying to get a finger on the pulse as to what the impacts might have here locally. We're starting to see some anecdotal impacts of it. So, as always, just trying to get ahead of it and see if we can understand what might happen. That sounds a little bit perhaps doom and gloom. I don't think that is the case, but
mm,
trying to find out some information from people and a business that are very much at the forefront of those macro evolving economics because they're a private equity firm. So yeah, had a good conversation this morning.
lovely, lovely, and from this sort of anecdotal evidence in terms of what potentially could be, I know you've been in the recruitment space for some time. You've probably seen the cycles. What's your sort of take on it? I'm just sort of curious.
Perhaps lucky enough to be young enough that I didn't experience the GFC, so I wasn't even in work at that time. I think I was still studying. So besides the COVID pandemic, haven't seen the corrections that do occur. You hear a lot of stories about what those
Mm,
markets can look like. So I wouldn't actually have any experience of it, to be honest. But we do know that recruitment hiring is one of the first things that could be paused, affected as a result of more cautious business planning, perhaps. So
mhm.
we'll see what
Got it.
happens. But it's not something I'd have any direct experience in so far.
What's interesting is that you've raised an interesting sort of topic in your responses about sort of self-reflection in yourself. And what's interesting is that it seems that a lot of organizations now are going through their own sort of self-reflection stage.
I agree. Yeah, employee experience is perhaps the caveat that is used. Or sorry, it's something that's become a lot more prominent from businesses in the way that they operate now. It's perhaps was in times past it was less of a business critical concern, but it's certainly now something that's spokenly more
Mm,
openly about, particularly because of the um, inability to access talent and keep staff. So employee experience is big, and I think what businesses are trying to do, and I think it's also a result. Perhaps we'll talk through this. I think it's also a result of the general population, if you might call that, having a little bit more of an urge or a need to find meaning through work. That's been perhaps um, a common transition of the
mm,
workplace in recent years. So I think people, particularly with the pandemic environment as well, people have reassessed and corrected the way they approach work and life, I think. And as such, they're looking to find meaning through their work or find work practices or employment in which they can pursue their own meaning, and they're able to do that with a workplace that supports them to do that. So I think that's something that's becoming a lot more prominent in with my generation, whether it's a generational thing or whether it's a sign of the times. But I think that's become a lot more prominent.
interesting. Do you think it's generational, or do you think it's sort of been prompted by COVID, where when you think about it, right, COVID has affected people in an unequal way.
I think it's perhaps both.
Hmm.
It's you're right. It's absolutely affected people in different ways. So it's not been an equal spread. From a generational perspective, I think it's certainly pertinent in that the perhaps we don't want to get into specific generations and be
Hmm.
restricted in that way, but it's fairly clear that the route to pursuing work and fulfillment was different to perhaps our parents' era and what they expected to gain through that progression versus people that come into workforce now. I think that's completely different in what they would expect from a career versus
Interesting.
30 or 40 years ago.